Welcome to my kitchen here at Trails N62. I'm going to be trying out my new electric pressure cooker today. I've done it once before with stuffed pepper soup. This time I'm going to be doing what's called burritos in a jar. I've never done this before, but I've got the recipe and we're going to give it a try. Just one thing on the recipe calls for pints, and I'm going to be doing pints. It calls for 1 tablespoon of brown rice. I don't have any brown rice. I don't ever use brown rice, so I'm not going to put any brown rice in. I'm just going to do the recipe without the brown rice. Just do it as is except for the brown rice. It might make it a little liquid because the rice absorbs some of the liquid, but we're going to go for it, try that, and see what happens. And if I have to cook it down a little bit, I'll cook it down a little bit. If I have to strain it, I'll strain it when I use it. We'll just see where it goes. So, we're going to get started here, and I'll show you what I'm doing here for burritos in a jar. Now this recipe starts out with dried beans, and according to the recipe you need to put the ingredients in the jar as they are in the recipe. Now you need to be sure when you're doing a recipe that you follow that recipe. As with anything that you can, if it's not in a canning book or something like that, you do at your own risk. There's a lot of people don't can meat. There's a lot of people don't do a lot of things when it comes to canning. There are things with canning that are not recommended or encouraged by the USDA, Department of Agriculture, or the FDA, or extension offices from the universities. So any canning that you do, you need to do at your own risk. So first of all, we're going to start with 1/4 cup of dried pinto beans. Now they need to be washed. I happen to have some that are pre-washed beans, and they've been taken care of pretty good, so I like those. They're a little bit more expensive sometimes, but we happen to be able to get a good deal on some. So 1/4 cup of dried beans is your first ingredient. Following that is the brown rice, which I'm not going to use. And then we have 1/4 cup of chopped onions. Now my onions happen to be reconstituted dried onions. So you're going to use 1/4 cup of freshly chopped onions. So these have been reconstituted from my dehydrated onions. I'm going to put in 1/4 cup. Hope I had enough here to do 5 pints. Looks like I had just enough onions rehydrated to put in there. And so if you're using fresh onions, it'll be 1/4 cup of chopped onions per pint. Next is green peppers, and it takes 1/4 cup of chopped green peppers per pint. Again, I'm using reconstituted green peppers because I dry my peppers now, and I just simply reconstitute them. Works out good for me. The flavor's intense. The next thing is going to be 3/4 cup of ground beef. Now you fry it up, cooked ground beef, cooked and drained. So it's 3/4 cup of ground beef. Cooked and drained. Unfortunately, it looks like 1 pound of ground beef is only going to make enough for 4 pints. Since it's only going to make enough for 4 pints, even though it's 90-10, it was great ground beef, I'm going to just add another 1/8 of a cup of pinto beans to this one, so I can go ahead and can all 5 pints. And it may be just a little bit more liquid than I want in the end, but we'll see how it comes out. Next up in our recipe is going to be, calls for rotel tomatoes. Now, I'm not going to use rotel tomatoes because, well, I don't have any rotel tomatoes. But I did look it up and say that, and it said you can substitute salsa. So I have some homemade salsa here. It's pretty thick salsa that I make and chunky. So I'm going to add this salsa to my jars instead of the rotel tomatoes, and it calls for 2 tablespoons. Two tablespoons of salsa rather than rotel tomatoes. Next is going to be taco seasoning, and a 1/2 tablespoon of taco seasoning. Now you can make your own taco seasoning if you prefer, which is okay. I just happen to have this, so I'm all about using what I have. Following the taco seasoning is some canning salt, kosher salt, pickling salt. Some people use sea salt. And it calls for 1/4 teaspoon of salt. Salt's basically for flavor. In this instance, it's not much for canning, but it's basically for flavor. And I like a little flavor in mine, so I'm just going to add a little 1/4 teaspoon. Kind of enhances the flavor a little bit. Salt does that. Alright. And finally, we top it all off with beef broth. Now the recipe doesn't say what kind of headspace. It just says to normal headspace. So we're going to go with 1 inch of headspace. Once you put your broth in, fill it up to 1 inch. Then you need to debubble it. You don't want air bubbles staying in there because that'll hinder the pressure cooking process. So just take your little debubbler. Some people use a chopstick. Some people have another fancy rig where they measure the depth, but I use the jar to measure the depth. And this little debubbler right here works great for me. What works for you is what you need to use. Alright, so we're debubbled. And we're ready to go. Put our lids on. First thing we're going to do is we're going to wipe our lids. Always wipe your lids. Make sure you wipe your lids. It's important so you don't get no food particles or anything in between your lid and the glass jar. Once again, I'm going to be using some vinegar because of the meat and the beans. The vinegar cuts the grease as well as removing the food particles, cleans the rims. Now if I was just doing something regular, I would just use a wet paper towel. But in this case, since I have meat and beans, I'm going to use a vinegar wipe. It's a good thing y'all can't see behind me over here. See that mess I've made. Alright. Now for our jar lids. They've been in hot water. I like to put mine in hot water to soften them up a bit. I seem to have a good deal on the sealing when I do that. Some people don't. I think they say now that you don't have to. But these in particular, these are kind of an off-brand lids because ball lids and cur lids and good name brand lids have been hard to find this year. So I ordered these on Amazon. I haven't had any trouble with them. Occasionally there's one that won't seal. They might sometimes buckle. You gotta be careful not to put the lids on too tight. Again, it's finger tight. Not too tight, but not too loose. Now these jars are not hot, so when I put them in the canner, I'm not going to put really hot water in there. I'm going to use hot water. The canner calls for hot water, so I'm going to use hot water, but it's not going to be really hot. Alright? Now let's get these in the canner. Now be aware, this is a canner. You need to be careful. This is not an Instapot. This is not just a pressure cooker. You can cook in it too, but it has to be designated for an electric one. It has, and for another one either. They have to be designated a canner. You can't pressure can with just a cooker. So make sure that it is a canner. Make sure it meets the requirements for a canner. Now once again, I'm going to put my vinegar in. That's the bowl I use to wipe down my jar. Now the reason is I've got hard water, and it keeps the outside of the jars from getting all cloudy up and are caked with lime and that sort of thing, mineral deposit. Same way with my inside my canner. It keeps it clean. Now my canner calls for 8 cups of hot water. So I put in my 8 cups of hot water. I've checked the lid and everything. Everything works good. Close the lid. Lock it down. I made sure my pressure gauge on top here, my weight, is on exhaust. And it says it right on there, exhaust. So that the steam will start coming out. And then I set my canner. I'll set it for 75 minutes. That's what you cook meat or beans on. In pints, I'll set it for 75 minutes. And then it will take care of the rest of it. The only thing I have to do is after the 10-minute venting beep goes off, then I close it. And the timing will automatically start. Alright? Let's get started here. Then I'm going to set it on high. Time going to be 75 minutes. Start. And it'll heat up, and then it'll start venting up top here. It'll vent out here for 10 minutes. It's automatic. After it's vented for 10 minutes, it will beep beep again. And then I'll turn the weight down to airtight. And then it will heat up to the right pressure, and then it'll start the timer to time the pressure cooking. And here we are. 5 jars of burritos in a jar. 5 pints. Made in my electric pressure cooker. I love that thing. It works great. Fairly automatic. And that's going to look good. It'll drain off the juices on that. Heat that up and put that on a burrito, tacos, put some tomatoes, lettuce, cheese on top of it. That'll be good. And there you have it. Burritos in a jar. Looks like it's going to be a good meal. Made in my Nesco electric pressure cooker I just got in. That's my second batch I made in it. First batch was stuffed pepper soup, and then these burritos in a jar. So I appreciate you joining me in my kitchen to your kitchen. God bless.